actually started being an activist in the 70s. And I mention it because I was politicized in the Hawaiian sovereignty movement, which was first and foremost in its earliest expression a cultural movement, right? It was a kind of cultural renaissance to reclaim Hawaiian culture, Hawaiian language, and to be able to come up from underground and start to actually live as Hawaiian people.
Mhm.
And it was really that context that created the popular base for what would eventually become a political movement for Hawaiian sovereignty that's ongoing to this day, that actually recently won some very big victories against the US military,
Mhm.
ending leases on land in Hawaii that had been occupied by the military and exploited by it. So I'm always happy to be in spaces with people who are cultural strategists and arts and culture people and people who are involved in systems thinking, even if I really don't understand system thinking particularly well. I'm going to share a story today about something that happened here where I live in Oregon in 1992. It was a long time ago. In that year, a evangelical authoritarian group called the Oregon Citizens Alliance placed a ballot measure 9, on the Oregon ballot. Ballot Measure 9 was an attempt to amend the Oregon Constitution to have LGBTQ people named under law as abnormal, wrong, unnatural, and perverse, and the legal equivalents of child molesters and people who commit acts of bestiality and necrophilia.
Mhm.
So the ballot measure was started out as as an initiative. The initiative broke records in how quickly they got the signatures necessary to get it to the Secretary of State's office, and then eventually it appeared in the Oregon ballot as Ballot Measure 9. And of course, this was a crisis for the LGBTQ community and for the community generally in Oregon. You know, this was a civil rights issue being decided by popular prejudice in an election that would perhaps change the Oregon Constitution in a way that would open the door to all kinds of discrimination toward various different groups. Key among the things is that, of course, it was targeted to people according to their sexual orientation and gender expression, but the word perceived is part of this, right?
Mhm.
And so if you can merely perceive someone to be gay and then fire them, evict them, or deny them public accommodations, then that can be extended to any other hated group. And so that was the situation we're in. Just to give you some context, though, Oregon is an interesting state in the US in that it was originally founded as a territory, as a whites-only homeland. So, Black people were denied entry into the state of Oregon. Those who were there could stay, but eventually, a subsequent law demanded that they leave under threat of the lash. And so Oregon's basically first settlers were people who were, to put it generously, very race sensitive. And in order to settle Oregon, of course, they also had to dispossess many Indian tribes. And so Oregon has more tribal terminations in the state than the rest of the west of the United States all put together. And what the original settlers did was to provide land grants to white settlers in the Northwest. And because they feared there would be retaliation, they also they did not want Black people in the territory, believing that Black people in the territory could unite with um, uh, Native Americans in insurrection. And so that was their original re reasoning. They also, though, abolished slavery in Oregon. And they abolished slavery in Oregon basically because these were pioneers. These were people who had been given fiefdoms in the East, but who weren't able to, because of not having the capital, not able to compete well with the giant slaveocracies of especially the southeastern part of the United States. And so they were driven west and then became enlisted in Indian removal programs and then finally ended up in Oregon and were very suspicious, very cynical of the idea that large capital could come to Oregon, especially slave-rich capital, that it would force them to have to migrate again. So that context is very important here because what it does is dictate waves of immigration into Oregon afterward that are primarily white because other people are excluded. Even Asian laborers were excluded and subject to sundown laws, so they could come into the state to work but would have to leave at night.
Mhm.
And so many waves of white flight. So the Great Migration, when formerly enslaved people went from field to factory and started to move north. was one of the drivers of migration into Oregon. Even the many of you may have heard of the LA uprising surrounding the beating of a man named Rodney King back in the 90s, drove a wave of migration from California into Oregon. Always people seeking safety and stability by coming to Oregon, which basically is coded for race, right? What they want to do is to come to an ethnically homogeneous state where many of the kinds of conflicts that they may have experienced in more diverse contexts would not happen. So Oregon, for that reason, is very conservative in many respects. Though its liberal core, the I-5 corridor, which the I-5 freeway runs through Oregon, contains some urban centers that are large and quite liberal. They grew over the course of the history of Oregon, whereas the rural counties basically remained the same. The population remained mostly stable. And so there's a huge urban-rural divide in terms of voting patterns and people's attitudes about groups like LGBTQ people. Um, Over half the population lives in Portland and Eugene, which are two very liberal towns, all blue, top to bottom, in the vernacular of the United States. In other words, all liberal. And so statewide elections can be won simply by getting the vote out in Oregon and Eugene. Just, to give you some sense of the context here in terms of urban-rural divide. So more immediately, Oregon also was subject to something called the Northwest Imperative, which was an initiative on the part of the white supremacist movement that began in the 70s to colonize the Northwest. And in particular, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington, Montana, and Wyoming. And so they targeted those states and Oregon in particular because of its history of Black exclusion. Oregon remains to this day still only 2% Black, for instance. And so there was a kind of migration of neo-Nazis, white supremacist intellectuals, authoritarians of various stripes to places like Oregon, where they settled and used money from a neo-Nazi group called the Order, which was active in that same period of time in the early 80s, which committed a number of different heinous acts, including the murder of a Jewish radio host in Denver, Colorado, named Alan Berg, and successful heists of armored cars and banks. So they had significant amounts of capital from those robberies, and they used that in order to get their people settled. So the Aryan Nations compound, which is famously known in the United States in Idaho, led by Richard Butler, was one of the investments that they made. It was actually a physical residential center where people would come to get trained in firearms and get ideological training. So that's one of the contexts. And as a result, in Oregon, a neo-Nazi skinhead group that had national affiliations, it was called East Side White Pride, were involved in the murder of an Ethiopian immigrant to Portland named Mulugeta Surah. They beat him to death on the streets of Portland. And the result was that immediately thereafter, whereas the pattern in most US cities when a murder of that sort occurs, hate crime statistics went up. So they did not go down. They were not suppressed by immediate police action. They were not suppressed by the kind of, political climate that surrounded the shock and awe of the murder. They actually went up, which is an indication of how well organized the neo-Nazi movement was in Oregon. They saw this as a green light situation, and so they started to up the level of activity as opposed to go into the corners and hide. So that shocked the community and had people thinking about these right-left dynamics that were emerging in Oregon in a really particularly critical way. In that same year, 1988, a group called the Oregon Citizens Alliance, which was an authoritarian evangelical group that sponsored Ballot Measure 9, sponsored another Ballot Measure 8. And Ballot Measure 8 rescinded a governor's executive order from 1987 banning discrimination against LGBTQ people in public employment. And so that law was taken down. And the Oregon Citizens Alliance accomplished this by running ads that featured what they cast as gay men preying on young children sexually. and making the claim that the only way a community that doesn't reproduce sexually can reproduce itself is through recruitment. And so all of your date children are in danger. So, they won with that campaign. And so that also sets some of the context for 1992. So some of the ways that these things play in, one is that there was already a lot of organized activity around the Sirah murder. I was involved in founding a group called the Coalition for Human Dignity that stood up a monitoring and research operation and counter-organizing operation in the city and then eventually the whole state. And so there were organized groupings all over the state that were concerned about the rise of hate crimes. The other thing is that in '88, when the No on 8 campaign was mounted, they had to do it under tremendous pressure and with very little time. And so they really weren't able to cobble together a full campaign. As a result, they did not make good use of volunteers from the community, and many people felt that it was a purposeful act of exclusion. And that perception was compounded by the campaign asking people to postpone public events like National Coming Out Day in order not to polarize the electorate before the election. So, for a community whose whole, movement is based on visibility, it really felt like being told that it would be better for everyone if you became invisible again. And so people became quite angry about it. And so there are a lot of different divisions in the community and infighting. And then in addition, donors to the No on 8 campaign, many of them believed it would be better not to fund the No campaign because it would create more visibility for the Yes campaign, and that context would polarize people with too few on our side. They anticipated we would lose. And so they held back their donations, but eventually came forward, which is part of the reason the campaign started late, and felt burned when they lost because they had been assured that actually the polling numbers looked good and that we could win. So by 92, we had a divided community. At the grassroots level, many felt they had been excluded from the previous campaign and been told to shut up and go silent. And so they were angry and they were anticipating more of the same. On the other hand, there were also donors who were burnt from the last time and uninterested in funding another such campaign. So early money wasn't right there to be had. That then slowed us down in terms of everything we could do, which then further compounded the sense that people were being excluded. It was a kind of a downward spiral that the campaign was in for a while. And we needed to correct all of those things and try to get on our feet and run a campaign. One of the things the campaign did in order to achieve this was to run an election for the campaign steering committee. And so a number of us were nominated, some of us not even with our knowledge, and elected to this steering committee. I was one of those people. And the steering committee was not a group of people who were necessarily familiar to the donor class. They were people who were considered significant leaders by people at the grassroots level. And so donors were not familiar with the steering committee members, and that further suppressed fundraising. So that was the kind of crisis-ridden situation we're in, which then also had looming over it the fact that we had done some baseline polling and it looked like we could easily lose because while we had a slight advantage, it was within what we consider the margin of lying. People often will say they won't vote for something that is so extreme as, constitutional amendment of that sort, but will actually do so in the privacy of the ballot box. And so we assumed that we were in a very tight race and could lose. So that was where we were at. So as you know, campaigns are really zero-sum kind of propositions. In a campaign, there's a winner and there's a loser. All of the strategies and tactics serve that end. And everything in terms of strategies and tactics must also be coupled by message campaigns that are about voter persuasion around a really simple thing, which is to get 50% plus one people to vote no, to take that action for whatever reason. And so that being the case, there wasn't a whole lot of room for community participation in something that felt really, really, really bad to people. I mean, people were terrified that we would lose again, and if we did, that this constitutional amendment would really create an unlivable environment for them in Oregon. And they also woke up one day to see that a ballot measure would be appearing on their ballot that their neighbors would be voting on that asks the question, are these people fully human? Right? And that having that be up for a popular vote was a slap in the face to people. It was such an indignity that they needed to be able to have their dignity restored, to be able to participate in a campaign where they could be recognized and respected and acknowledged for being full human beings and contributors to the community. And so the campaign was never going to be able to meet that aspiration, not fully. And so we were in a rock between a rock and a hard place. We couldn't fund a campaign that would be that broad-based in its ambitions. We were having difficulty funding the campaign we could put together that would be more specifically in the tradition of campaigns. And then there's about the maintaining the kind of agreements that you make with donors who, when they give you money, expect you to deploy a traditional campaign in order to win. And so that was sort of the situation. But I'm a movement builder. Cynthia, earlier when we were having conversation, referenced a friend of mine named Suzanne Farr, who's also a movement builder and was in Oregon at the time. And a number of other people who were in the community also had this perspective. What we need is a movement campaign. And of course, that means trying to figure out, what all the interconnected interests are, right? What are the interconnected issues? How do we therefore then put together a kind of network of stakeholders and build the relationships necessary in order to be able to deal with the problem that we're facing in a broader context that allows for post-campaign continued organizing and that would actually put together the kind of coalitions we needed on the ground in order to face off against both the white nationalist movement and the Christian nationalist movement as it was emerging in the state. The other thing was that, unintended consequences are not something that most campaigns ever take into consideration. While we all know that every choice will have a downside, that's not taken into consideration necessarily when you're in campaign decision making. Um, and that, thinking about creating new kind of emergent sort of outcomes, finding leverage points for the movement broadly was also not part of the thinking, and certainly not how victories can create new problems. And this victory, I will tell you later, did, in fact, create a number of new problems. So that's sort of the situation that we were in. So basically, in order to overcome, well, I'll give you a little more context because there's something important to keep in mind here. This was important, especially important. The movement campaign was particularly important because the Oregon Citizens Alliance was not a single issue LGBTQ group, anti-LGBTQ group. They were affiliate of the Christian Coalition, which at the time was a very big network that had many local nodes all the way across the country that would be gathered annually in Road to Victory conferences where they would be trained and deployed to be able to do things like move these anti-LGBTQ ballot measures on the ground. For them, the anti-LGBTQ ballot measure was really a Trojan horse. It was an opportunity to exploit popular prejudice in order to build their war chests and in order to be able to exercise power in state politics. And so, we had to keep an eye on their broader agenda, which was to go after civil rights more broadly, and in particular, abortion rights and abortion access and family planning. And of course, they were clearly targeting immigrants in Oregon and had a deportation kind of agenda. And so, with all of that in mind, we felt like it was necessary for us to start to reach out to and build relationships with many different kinds of groups that you might not typically think of as participating in a campaign like this. In order to appease donors, we, assume roles that we might not necessarily have assumed in order to be able to create the kind of hierarchy they wanted to see within the campaign. So I was the director of statewide development and outside PR person for the campaign. So I talked to the national media and regional media around Oregon, and I basically did a bunch of by statewide development, what that meant was developing the infrastructure through which we could do GOTV statewide in every county in Oregon. And so,
GOTV is
Oh,
GOTV is get out the
get
vote.
out the vote. Yeah, so that we could get out the vote in every county in Oregon.
Mhm.
And so, my job was to create little nodes in each of the counties and then to also do the kind of more direct voter engagement campaigns in the most populous counties surrounding Portland. So, that was what I was intended to do. You also have to keep in mind that at the time, the LGBTQ community did not contain within it a critical mass of people who knew how to do public organizing. And for the very good reason that it was dangerous. Going door knocking on an LGBTQ issue felt really dangerous. And And among all groups in Oregon, LGBTQ people were the most targeted for hate crimes. And so it was, difficult proposition to try to build something out of a community that had done wonderful work in organizing and educating people about LGBTQ issues, but had very little experience in lobbying and putting together a direct political campaign. In fact, at the time, the most important state organization was called the Right to Privacy PAC. And the Right to Privacy PAC had that name specifically in order to avoid having to put the words gay and lesbian on pieces of mail that would go to donors because donors would not give if that were the case. And so that's the kind of context that we're in. What they did was they basically framed the appeal around the idea of amending the Constitution to enshrine bigotry and called that too extreme, right? That we basically took the position you can hate LGBTQ people if you want to, that is your right. But once you make that the law, you create a problem that can come back and affect you and others that you love, right? And so we needed to put together the widest array of communicators possible. And so we polled to see who the most trusted communicators were. And we put those people on TV ads and started to try to build out the kind of base for the campaign. Um, but there was still the community to consider and the need to build more broadly. And the campaign was not designed for that purpose. So some of us went outside the kind of coloring outside the lines and started to organize a variety of other things. So one of the things was to put together a cultural campaign. This campaign was slow to put up lawn signs and stickers and buttons for people. And so what we did was we just came up with our own button campaign, and we also engaged artists in putting together posters that were inspiring. One was if you have ever known love, vote no on 9. And we started to distribute those in the community so people could put them up in their windows and that they could start to sell the buttons in their businesses and wear the buttons and the stickers everywhere. And they became such popular items that I think to this day people remember the no on 9 fad, right? They were just everywhere. And so that was one of the ways that we were able to give people something to do that made them feel like I can be visible and I can take action. The other thing was that we worked with a different group of artists, people who were in the entertainment industry, in particular in Hollywood. I had a friend who was a movie director named Gus Van Sant, and so we were able to appeal to him and get him to put together a fundraiser and a number of other contacts with key Hollywood influencers. And by doing that and making it very public, what people in Oregon felt like were people outside the state actually care about us. People I know who are famous to me, like Deborah Winger or Faye Dunaway, like actually is saying that she wants to protect us. And so that had a really good effect to kind of loosen up the chilling that was happening. But what it also did was it created a magnet for all of those big donors who were holding back money. So if one of the most famous gay movie producers in the United States, Scott Rudin, is going to make a major donation, I better too, because I want to be in the same group as him. And so that really worked. And through that, then we were able to put together a major visibility campaign that went national. And so we all appeared on various different talk shows and whatnot, and that created yet another layer of context, right? In particular, we were able to work with the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force to get writer Michael Signorilli to place 9 consecutive editorials in the New York Times calling for people to vote no on 9. And that opened the door to national fundraising and some international visibility as well. And so, with all of that, we were able to kind of create the mojo for people to feel like this is something I want to be involved in no matter what. But we still faced opposition. Group of people organized something called the No on Hate campaign in the same year. And the No on Hate campaign was formed because of their concern that they would be asked once again to go invisible and that they wanted to have a vehicle to be visible if that happened. And, I'll just say, quite frankly, the two campaigns fought with one another.
Mm.
And so I had to actually kind of function as a sort of diplomat, as did Suzanne, Cynthia, and basically make the argument inside the campaign that there was no point in fighting with them, just let them go, right? They're going to be able to capture the participation of people that won't participate in a traditional political campaign, and that's just fine, right? The campaign should be a bulwark, and behind that bulwark, there should be many expressions. And so that then set a precedent, and we were able to create a number of other no on 9 subgroupings. African Americans voting no on 9, Latinos voting no on 9, people of faith voting no on 9, Asians and Pacific Islanders voting no on 9, Native Americans voting on no on 9. It was just a bunch of different kinds of groupings that we were able to put together. And we were able to also form a really strong relationship with the Farm Workers Union in Oregon and their network of immigrant rights advocates. So that allowed us to start to mobilize in a really different way and from a multitude of different perspectives. So it wasn't just one communications plan, but more of a kind of broad narrative that emerged around the campaign and how it would affect us and what it would mean if it passed, even if it could be rolled back through the Supreme Court, right? Because it was clearly an unconstitutional measure, what kind of precedent it would set. And so we were able to mobilize, significant number of people. We eventually got 11,000 volunteers on our rolls, and our canvassing operation was pretty detailed and wide and reached out pretty widely. A group called the Rural Organizing Project, which still exists and does magnificent work in Oregon, got stood up in that period as well, and they took on the work of moving people in rural counties. So even in Wheeler, Oregon, which has a population of, I believe, less than 1,000 people, one gay man came out to every single one of his neighbors by standing outside the post office and handing them Noah 9 flyers and saying, let me introduce myself to you again. Did you know I'm gay? And so, there was just a lot of that kind of thing that happened all around the campaign. We also set up something called the Homophobic Violence Documentation Project, and that documented the acts of violence that were happening around the state, which were quite extraordinary. There was actually one firebombing in which 2 people died. And so by publicizing those things as sort of kind of collateral consequences of this kind of, promotion of divisive thinking and hate, we were able to expand even further. But, we also created Republicans voting no on 9 and, a lot of different kinds of formations of that kind. So the coalition became quite broad. And then formally, all the labor unions eventually came on board because the context was that, like their constituents were all involved in the campaign in one way or another. The labor organizers were turning out to help us organize canvases. And so they came under quite a bit of pressure. And so, we were able to put together a large labor coalition as well. So all of that led us to victory on election day, right? Yahoo! Wow, yay, we won. We won by with 50% of the 56% of the vote, which is more than we thought we would do. So we were quite encouraged by it, though it was the case that 44% of the people voted to change the Constitution to have it made illegal. And so, it was just a consequence of the fact that they put it on the ballot measure that it would politicize the issue for people who probably never thought about it before or gave it much thought as a political idea, and also consolidated a base for anti-LGBTQ politics, especially in Oregon's rural counties.
Mm.
So immediately after the No on 9 campaign declared victory, The Oregon Citizens Alliance then placed ballot measures on, I forget how many, maybe 32 different county and municipal ballots around the state, and won all but I think two.
Wow.
And so those eventually got rolled back by the Supreme Court. But you can imagine what it feels like to people in those rural counties who are voting for those things. It feels like being disenfranchised,
Mhm.
right? In a situation in which they're already largely disenfranchised or feel disenfranchised in statewide politics, because as I said earlier in this story, over half the population lives in all liberal Portland and Eugene. And so you can't elect a governor, you can't elect a secretary of state. Ballot measures, statewide ballot measures usually go the other way. And your county electeds and state representatives have very little influence in the legislature, even though they represent the most of the geography of the state of Oregon. And what many might think, perhaps in the white supremacist tradition, as the Oregon tradition. And so that kind of polarization was something we did not immediately anticipate and should have, because there were ways that we could have mitigated it. But it did happen, and it has forever changed politics in rural Oregon. So thank goodness for groups like the Rural Organizing Project courageously standing up and continuing to fight the good fight. But the conditions under which they're doing it are very difficult. The combination of the Northwest imperative and the kind of migration patterns to Oregon, combined with the way the Oregon Citizen Alliance was able to politicize people first on the LGBTQ issue, and then on abortion and other issues, put them in a situation where their opposition in those rural counties was extremely organized. And it's still the case that the density and radicalism of white nationalist groups is greater in Oregon per the population than pretty much anywhere around the country.
Mhm.
So that was kind of the story of that time and what happened. It was complicated, yes. And if you ask like 10 different people who were involved in the campaign, they would all tell you different stories. Because the campaign basically needed to compartmentalize a bunch of different things, or at least people compartmentalized around the campaign, a bunch of different efforts that the campaign wasn't going to be able to engage in, and had to develop the discipline to, go on canvases and actually move the campaign message, but also then do the other work as well, while the campaign was happening. And people like Suzanne Farr were really key to helping that to continue. I was basically out of it by like 2.5 months from election day because I was canvassing. And so, it really took community leaders like that, mostly unpaid, to stand up and really take action. But they did. And now I just want to end by saying, as a result, Oregon has one of the strongest LGBTQ statewide organizations in the
Mhm.
country, right? The Right to Privacy campaign changed their name to Right to Pride immediately after the campaign victory, and then basically merged with something called the Support Our Communities Political Action Committee, which was formed out of the campaign's lists, to form Basic Rights Oregon, which is that statewide organization I mentioned. And the Rural Organizing Project still exists and continues to be in a really powerful relationship with our United Farm Workers Union and the network of immigrant rights organizations that they coordinate.
Thank you, Scott. It sounds like such a rich experience. Oh my goodness. So much to reflect on there. Julia, do you have any questions you want to ask Scott before you dive into your further?
No, this is so fun for me. And when you asked me to do this, I didn't even really think honestly, I didn't know which story Scott was going to tell,
Right.
but I lived through this. I'm from Oregon. I
Wow.
vividly remember organizing No for Nine. I remember the buttons. I remember my church community getting involved. I was in college at that point, but I came back. And so I've heard Scott talk about this before, but so this is actually, I feel verklempt actually right now. Just even being able to comment from a systems perspective on something that was very meaningful to me as an Oregonian. And I left in 1988. So, it's been many years.
Mm.
Um, so you want me like 15 minutes more or less, right?
Yeah,
Sydney,
yes.
so yeah, okay, this is kind of a complicated topic, but it doesn't have to be so complicated, systems thinking, by the way. I think sometimes we might overcomplicate what it means to be thinking at like a
Mhm.
systems. practitioner. I do have a couple of links that I'll share with you after my comments, but there's a Rumi poem that I love that kind of captures the essence of maybe systems thinking and systems practice. Is the quote goes like this: if you think because you understand one, you must also understand two, because one and one make two. But remember, you also need to understand and.
Mm.
And that's kind of the essence. It's like there's one and one make two, but what is the and part? This is the both and thinking that is like the essence for me of creating the possibility out of systems that are complex, and you're thinking relationally, and there's a whole bunch of practices you bring into the work when you think about the systems that you're trying to impact. But basically, we're not just looking at one and one. And I think we're all trained to analyze like this is happening. And sometimes we might even incorporate the historical context, like Scott, brought in all of Oregon's kind of exclusionary racist history into the case. But what is the magical and that you bring into the systems work, and what do those practices look like? So, systems that as it's, one of the metaphors we use, and some of you may know this a lot, is that, we talk about clock problems and we talk about cloud problems.
Mm.
And the clock problem is if a clock or a watch breaks and there's all of the pieces on the floor, it's complicated to put the watch back together. But you've got all the pieces, and you could actually figure out, if somebody gave you the map, how to put the watch back together. That's a clock problem. And and then there are cloud problems, which are the shifting clouds in the sky that are constantly moving, and you actually can't really grasp onto them and control them and solve for them to go in the right direction that you want to go, but you can observe the weather patterns, and then you can adapt accordingly. Do I need to bring the umbrella or I don't? And what Scott is sharing with us is not a clock problem, even though oftentimes we organize in our movement spaces as if we're trying to just put the clock back together and there is a right answer, and if you do this, this will happen. And what Scott, all of the complexity that Scott was talking about really did illustrate the way that these practices are put into place. So I'll name them quickly, and I'll maybe share what my interpretation of Stott's story is with some of these practices. But one of the ways that we work within systems that are constantly changing and built on years of mindsets and paradigms and deep, deep you know, uh, ways of being, mindsets, that are entrenched in our politics and in our culture. One of the ways is helping the system see itself as a system.
Mm.
Scott ended by talking about the ways that he had to allow a whole bunch of different people to adapt within their own constituencies. So he was being adaptive. This is one of the practices. But the whole system also has to say, we will all be impacted by this action. And so then, therefore, we need you to see how you will be impacted by this thing that will happen in the system that has implications for all of our rights moving forward. This is one of the ways that a system sees itself, I was actually thinking the example goes back to how you started, Scott, was like your first organizing experience in Hawaii was an unseen, concealed system and story that you were elevating that couldn't be ignored, this Hawaiian sovereignty. And that's a part of seeing a system that needs to see itself for all of its, splotches and good parts and bad parts. But then also, you're just another practice of working systemically is working at different levels. And so, yes, you are working it was great to hear how eventually the national groups came on board and that solidarity unlocked as much as it did with regards to funding and visibility. But being able to we're right now, at least in the United States, we kind of have this debate about, change happens at the grassroots level. We need to go local. We need people closest to the problem to be the most engaged in our activism, which of course is right. Like, yes, the people closest to the problem. And in Scott's case, he's talking about a group of people who were asked, with Ballot Measure 8 to just be quiet and sit down, and how awful that feels sometimes. And so you say we need to elevate those voices. And we need to work concurrently to incorporate that into others' voices as well. And what does it mean to hold those tension? This is one of those both and moments, because another practice is identifying connections and how parts interact. So, as the kind of bedrock of a systems practice is you make an intervention, hopefully strategically, thinking where you have the most leverage to change a system. But then, as Scott was saying, you have to notice what happens when you do that, because you may have unintended consequences. And I think we're not as good at that in movement space, are we? We really, if we've got the right slogan, if we've got the right, group that feels good to be together with, and then we do a thing, where and how are the containers to observe when we've had the blowback that we didn't necessarily expect to be there? So, engaging with the sense making of how are my interactions having an impact, and then being able to pivot accordingly, so that you really can then say, part of your historical precedence was like someone was murdered in Oregon, and you would have thought something would happen. You would have thought there would be such outrage. People would be fighting for racial justice. But oh my gosh, all of a sudden everyone is galvanized. And you've got a white supremacist movement that is that much more uh, unfortunately emboldened. Well, these are all signals of change, that we just have to have our antennas up, which is a part of the systems practice. And that's part of also engaging kind of different perspectives. And so, when Scott was saying, like, okay, if we're having a broader agenda of, rural organizers and other folks who will see this differently than how we see it, this isn't just having a systems lens, it's helping your sense making be informed by a whole bunch of different folks. And good organizers that do this, I think, naturally. Actually, we're trying to draw in different perspectives. But this takes so much time. It takes time to slow down and then resolve the conflicts. I mean, I'm glad, Scott, that you brought up like the fracturing within the movement and how that conflict was managed, because I think good systems practitioners know that there will be tension, which is sometimes necessary for the evolution to happen. So when that conflict allowed for the generating of people to do the campaign work in the way that they felt that they needed to do it, and not to be as controlling of how it happened. Because what's interesting about systems work and what I bring into my practice all the time is that we think somehow the system is out there. We need to change the system and you are all going to change, as opposed to remembering, like, we are the system. We are swimming in the system. We are not separate from the system we are trying to change. So that when you all decided to elect a steering committee, and that was like a game changer, because you were actually demonstrating the way that this movement was going to, this coalition was going to come about, was going to practice the democratic ideals that you wanted to see in the world. You were being the system, maybe unconsciously, but those are the words that I would put. And I think sometimes the work that we do, where this is another Rumi quote, right? Yesterday I was, oh, I'm not going to come up with the right words, but I was smart, so I wanted to change the world, and now I'm wise, I'm going to change myself. Basic context. And I think that we've got to see the system and how we represent the system that we're trying to change. The just a couple more that I'll mention, and then I'll end with these, is that, we do consider kind of different time scales in the work that we do. And so there's the now, there's the history, and then there's the, like, what are we building towards? And I think, Scott, that you brought that in really well, but also we're looking with 2020 hindsight, aren't we, with regards to the backlash of what this organized citizen alliance was building at the same time as we were building. And so, the long-term time scale of what we're really building towards beyond any one movement or any one campaign, I think it still behooves us to see this kind of broader system, because what we're really doing is we're looking for those patterns.
Mm.
We're constantly sense making, but then that informs strategy and informs who we're listening to and who we're building with. Because then this is a practice. We're constantly learning, we're constantly adapting within a system that never stops shifting. This is the other thing. The system is always changing. Our world is not stagnant. And this is really hard work for us because we're not trained that way. We are trained as linear thinkers. We are funded through linear projects that have activities, objectives, impact that we kind of sort of sometimes have to make up, because of course, how could we have possibly, proved that we did this within a systemic change beyond just checking, widgets and numbers? And so we're in a sick system of how we're funded and how this work comes together. So I think I appreciate Scott mentioning, like, when funders came in, when they didn't come in, what we were allowed to do, what we weren't allowed to do, who was, in, the core, who wasn't in the core, because, all of the ways that this work is supported, incentivized, is a part of a sick, dare I say, capitalist system, that pays for this, somehow. And this is like a bigger question that we've got to deal with. But those are just some thoughts, and then I'm going to share a document on systems practice. And just say it's not a silver bullet. It is a way, it is a mindset, though, of embracing the ambiguity and the complexity and the both and thinking, to kind of open up the possibility of who we're doing this with and for, and to be constantly observing what these patterns are and to question our own assumptions. That's where I'll end.
Thank you, both of you. I think it's only fair to ask Scott if you want to, like, respond to anything or add anything before we open it up to questions for everyone here for a bit before we break into groups.
Um, Only that that was really useful, Julia. That was really useful. I'm starting to wrap my head around the whole thing now. But it is interesting how incidentally we ended up functioning in these roles. Of course, we didn't start off thinking that, like we stumbled into it. It was a kind of process of iteration that got us to the point where we started to think, well, maybe what we need to do is build everything around the campaign, right? And so yeah, so I just found that really interesting and useful. So thank you.
Hmm, Thanks. Um, I have a question in my mind, which I'm going to just lay out and then see who else has questions. But question in my mind is if you can identify learnings from that experience that you think inform your practice in the anti-authoritarian movement today. Like, is there some things that you're doing now that you can see, oh yeah, I'm doing it this way because of that experience? Just curious.
Well, one thing is that what I learned from that experience is that social movements are messy.
Mm.
And in order to try to bring them together, you have to think more like you're herding cats than you're herding sheep. You know what I mean? The
Yeah.
people can have minds of their own, and that it's really important to recognize that and to engage people as whole people, right?
Mm.
So, movements are messy, but that messiness also yields a lot of good stuff. And then, of course, that people get involved in social movements because they want recognition,
Mm.
acknowledgement, respect. I mean, it's easy enough to figure out how to get a loaf of bread if you're hungry. There are many ways to do that that don't involve having to join a march and go every day to some campaign headquarters in order to try to get ready to campaign at your state legislature or whatever it happens to be the target. People turn out because it gives them meaning, and that needs to be taken into account too. So in this sort of systems thinking way, is thinking about the narrative in
Mm.
which that meaning then takes on something more powerful for people. How do
Mm.
the stories interact? How do they link together? The narrative strategist Liz Mann says that, stories are like stars, but narratives are like constellations, right?
Mm.
So how do we make meaning of all those stories together is also part of the work of weaving together movements. And, campaigns are really poor vehicles for that. And that was the other thing I learned, right? It is really important that they exist and they serve the function that they do, but to have too many expectations of them, I think, is really dangerous.
Mm.
It creates a tension that can't be resolved and that actually doesn't need to be resolved because we have the agency to do all of the things that we wish to do. If only we recognize the power we have when we act collectively.
Mm.
So those were some of the things. And then I guess the one other thing was that I learned how powerful arts and culture can be.
Mm.
All the button makers I mean, literally in the campaign, people would be like, oh no, now they're making buttons. We didn't approve of them. That was the reaction because I mean, that typically would be how a campaign would react. But
Mm.
all the button makers and the poster makers and the people who made t-shirts and all of this other stuff that happened around the campaign actually was as important in many ways to the campaign as anything else. It's a huge reason we had 11,000 volunteers.
Mm.
We could literally turn out like 2,000 of them at a time.
Mm.
And so, that created that context and also gave people ways of engaging that changed the culture.
Mm.
I mean, people were able to test the waters and figure out actually, people will say no to something like this. Allies will stand up. People you didn't ever expect will help you. Republican state legislators are letting us go on their canvas routes so that we can move our talking points.
Yeah.
It's it's that kind of thing that emboldens people and gives them the confidence to step up even more strongly, which the vehicles that came out of the campaign allowed people to do. So, yeah,
Yeah.
they're all great lessons. Nothing's perfect, but even out of a broken vessel, we can, good things can be had.
Yeah. So, Armine, I see you've helpfully invited people to raise hands or put questions in the chat. Anything you're curious about or any reflections that you have that we want to that you'd like to bring out in the shared learning space. Anyone? Yeah, let's see. I just lost you. That was Efrat.
Yeah, hi. Hello, everybody. Uh, thank you so much for an amazing story that I'm just waiting to watch like the movie of it. It sounds like such a great movie. It's kind of perfect for a movie. It has all the elements of thank you. I was just thinking kind of what you said, like it's something I concern. I'm a professor of social work. I teach systems and I believe in systems, but the issue of meaning the issue of meaning, as you said, Scott, is so important, and often kind of meaning is totally it doesn't always exactly synchronize with systemic needs, as it were. In other words, as you said, like you can find bread, but you can get your needs met, but sometimes you'll do crazy things for meaning or very good things for meaning, and so that dialectic is something that I think about a lot, especially now in Israel, where we're fighting against this war. and kind of we're out on the streets every night. And some of us, many of us, are out on the streets every night, and we're kind of, and it doesn't seem to be kind of systemically changing things, but people get a lot of meaning from going out there, even if we haven't managed to change anything, then it creates a strong sense of meaning. I don't know. So I just find it really interesting the way people will do so. So I don't know. I like that dialect.
Thanks.
So it was more comment than a question. Sorry.
But you'll see that Scott put into the chat a link to a movie. So it's been made.
There you go.
Actually,
Bill?
the link is to a website which tells a wonderful story, and there's a
Ah.
movie out there in the world somewhere called Ballot Measure 9.
Okay, cool.
Great. Thank you.
Bill? You're muted.
You go. Bill Cleveland. I'm in Alameda, California. So Scott, when you talked about the power of artists in the mobilization effort, and the struggle obviously is to find a narrative that that most of the people in your 11,000 volunteer group felt some semblance of affinity for and solidarity for, which is an enormous and amazing accomplishment. Anybody that's been involved in these kinds of things, you know, it's more than cats. You know, it's a cattle drive. But the question I have is, you mentioned the posters and the buttons and the T-shirts and those kinds of things, and often in this work, that's the first place that people go when the arts community becomes involved, which is to basically materialize symbols and make the message a real thing in the world. But I think we know, and this is a much more difficult endeavor, is that you look at something like the Laramie Project, where you leapfrog over the materialized symbols because they're actually in the way in that circumstance. And you create a work of art that literally takes the narrative by the shoulders and shakes it and, you know, does two things at once, which is says, this is a complex, multiple voiced system. There is a system here. The Laramie Project was a systems project, basically. But it dramatized the system in a way so that the people involved outside of Laramie and in Laramie, I think, not everybody, literally became co-owners to in a new narrative. And I'm wondering if in retrospect or whatever, if you think about what it would take to set that up, to make the conditions that would allow for that kind of work to happen in complex movements like the ones we're in the middle of now. And actually Julia as well, just either of you, just thinking about that challenge.
Well, I'll just quickly say that in the context of the campaign, it something like that never occurred to us. You know, I mean, we weren't cultural strategists.
Right.
We really literally thought, let's make this campaign cool, you know, make it into a cultural event.
Right.
And you know, so we even did we even hosted a concert headlined by the band Nirvana, which many warned us not to do. But we just believed that we needed to get young people involved and that having Nirvana come to Oregon for a concert could also help us break the back of the neo-Nazi skinhead movement by surfacing people in that context who might be willing to do some counter-organizing. But we just weren't, you know, in that mindset. Well, I understand what you're saying, and I know of a number of different instances of really good work of that kind. One is the Anne Frank Center in Boise,
Yeah.
Idaho. You
Yeah.
know, it's really magnificent memorial, but it's also a community effort. You know, I mean,
Yeah.
people buy the stones and put their names on them, and all of it. And the educational programs they host out of it are really, effective at moving the community to a particular place around that historical set of events and dynamics. So there are things like that, and other famous incidents that you probably all know better than I do. I did some research into this a while back, and there are interesting things, like the Paper Museum and other famous examples, but we just weren't in that mindset.
Julia, any thoughts for you?
Well, just that I think you're highlighting a need for the ways that we're going to be shifting our thinking and our practices and our mindsets about the deeper cultural and systemic shifts that we're working on. I think there's a consciousness of this being a needed practice, and that's part of why I think people like Scott and I are spending as much time as we are with arts and cultural workers right now, because we see the importance of what you're talking about and wanting to be together in new ways so that we can like be hopefully breathing life into the kinds of ways of doing this work that you're talking about, Bill.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks. Amy, you have a question?
Yes, thank you. Thanks, everyone. I've been working in the dance and somatic world for most of my life. And so my question, I think, namely for you, Julia, but Scott, if you have sensibilities on this as well, I'm wondering, for my own self, I know that changing to systems theory, changing to these approaches, my body has gone through such amazing stress responses. I'm trying to protect myself. I'm trying to go back to the familiar. I really want the binary. I want a right or wrong. I want a yes or no. Us and them feels actually more comfortable than what do you mean? Okay. So the grief that happens with that can happen, the vulnerability, the sense of loss, the sort of primal fear that can come within our stress responses. How are you approaching that with humans as you welcome them into systems theory? Thanks, Julia.
Oh my gosh, you are like naming something that I have had at least 10 conversations about in the last 5 days, honestly. That we're all grappling with what you just named. And my main point, I guess, that I would say is that we have to be really intentional with like the containers that we're creating. And that there will be containers for grief and rage and self-care and community and rest, and that is as important as all of the movement work that we're also then going to be doing together. And that sometimes, we can't force the strategic systemic thing to happen if we haven't sequenced the containers in the right way. And not everybody has to do everything. That's the other thing that I would say. Like within the systems approach, if one of the things that you would be called to do, for example, is to just create the space for people to be embodied in their grief, then that's your place in the system, having that container, and then allow yourself to be, but then know and be in relationship with the others that then have the connections to what other folks are doing. So it's not that you have to then be complex and bring in all the different, constituencies together and be the connector weaver person. Not everybody's got to do that work. And that's totally okay. And I think that's a part of us accepting both the sequencing and the different roles that we play within movements, and just to even know yourself. So I think part of the systems work is just having the ability to be self-reflective. Where am I right now? What do I need? What am I capable of? What does the movement need of me? And it might be to just be the place where people are going to come and feel their bodies deeply, and then hopefully be able to be together in new ways.
Thank you, Julia. As my mom would say, my liver just relaxed. She would always say that when something felt like it landed in the body. So thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Scott, do you want to add anything?
Um, I don't think so. I mean, that I get that question all the time as well, you know. And I guess that the one thing is, out of sort of my Hawaiian background, that there is a lot to be said for thinking about balance, right? So a central concept in the Hawaiian culture is the idea of pono. That's why the state anthem is Hawaii Pono'i. It's Pono is is balance, balance between people, nature, our bodies, our minds, the whole thing, and that justice and the balance go to hand in hand. That without that balance, justice becomes impossible. Equity is not possible. And so I think of that in everything that I am doing around trying to figure out how to sustain myself through all of what we're facing. And so I'm glad that you're focusing on the body and that you're sharing that practice with people. I think it's really, really important right now that we figure out how, all of these inputs that are facing us, many that feel really threatening, are embodied by us and not just, like something you think about, but something that you're feeling throughout your entire body. I mean, lately I've had dizzy spells and stiff necks and, all kinds of things like that that I suspect are really just reactions to the sense of being overwhelmed by so much stuff happening, and I think a lot of people are experiencing similar things.
Yeah, thank you, Scott, for that. And as you were speaking, it made me think also too about how the stress responses we may be having in the first place then generate these conflicts, right? Not only as we're figuring out how to navigate our bodies to dismantle them, but how our bodies get in the way of us of living like we want to live in the first place now.
Yeah, wounded animals lash out or withdraw, right?
So before we break up into groups, I want to just see if Polly, my colleague, is a senior fellow in Impact, wants to address this question of balance from the perspective of Indigenous knowledges, because even though you weren't able to hear our whole discussion, I was thinking that maybe there's something top of mind that you could say that would be illuminating here. Paul?
Cherokee worldview, we'd say that our trickster Chistu, the rabbit, was at play. I had two different links. One said 2, one said 2:30, and neither one would let me in. But Cindy sent me a link that allowed me to come in. So I'm sad that I missed the beginning of what sounds like a very powerful story, Scott. But I did get in time just to hear the very end of it and to hear Julia's very powerful and I think very appropriate analysis or a response to that through systems theory land. But to your particular question, Cindy, Cherokees don't have a word, at least all the Cherokees that I've worked with and ones who've written about this don't have a word that's peace, but they have a word that's tohi. So the word we say when we come closest to saying peace is no tohi daidehesti. May we all live together in peace. But that means to be in balance, to be in good relationship with all things. So the peace starts within us and our interrelationships with other humans, with other Cherokees, with other non-Cherokees, with enemies. Now, that's very challenging. And think about what you said about tightening up in your body, Amy. You think about being a good relationship with your enemies, but then a good relationship with the more than human relatives. So the star nations and the buffalo nations and the seas and the lands. And it's as Julia said, it's constant shifting. Not only are the clouds shifting all of the time, but all of the things around us are changing. And yet we have a responsibility to all of those relationships, to help care for them. So it's not, an ungrounded, that kind of romanticized philosophical tradition, but a lived tradition where we need to meet those responsibilities to all of our relations. But that balance and harmony is much closer and Cherokee worldviews to what we're striving towards rather than peace. And I think justice is woven all throughout that, because you cannot be in good relationship with your relatives if you have not worked out, constantly implementing forms of justice.
Any last thoughts or any last reflections that anyone wants to share?
I think I just want to tell Scott, because it came up really strongly in our group, that you gave us hope. that by listening to an old story and how it worked and how kind of lost you were and how you meandered and you did this and that and you weren't sure what would work, but in the end, sorry, excuse me, lucky we're on Zoom, you won't get my cough. But in the end, you reached somewhere different, somewhere good, and many people said in the group that this really gave us a feeling of hope. So thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for staying up to the last minute of this gathering. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Cindy and Polly. Thank you so much for making this happen and for creating this space. And we are now working on the design of the third session of this mini series. And we will be announcing it like probably later next week. Please stay tuned and hope to see you again sometime in June.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thank you. Take care.